Walinya. Hello, my name is Caroline Hughes and I'm one of many Ngunnawal elders of the Ngunnawal Nation. My mob are the Byaligo, Namich and Woolloobalua, also known as the Bells and Browns families of the Ngunnawal tribe. I'd like to acknowledge all that have joined us online, and I acknowledge the many beautiful ancestral countries of my fellow Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples from all over Australia. And of course, our many non-Indigenous friends. I stand here humbled that I've been invited to provide a virtual presentation on the topic of caring for country or healing country. As a person, I'm very proud that I live and work on the homelands of my people, the Ngunnawal country. Before I go further, I thought it would be an opportunity to share with you a little of Ngunnawal country. Ngunnawal Dara, which means this is Ngunnawal country. Daranura, which means this place is our home. There are 7 clans that make up the Ngunnawal Nation, and we have links with our language that is reflected in the suburb names of today. The Ginninderra, the Mlongolo, Pialigo, Namaji, Queanbeyan, Tuggeranong and Woolloobalua. Our neighbouring tribes are the Gundungurra to the north, the Ngarigo to the south, the Yuin on the south coast, and of course the Wiradjuri inland. Ngunnawal country encompasses Braidwood, Burrawa, Canberra and Goulburn, Gaylong, Harden, Murrumburra, Jugiong, and of course Queanbeyan. Canberra itself means meeting place. It's a Ngunnawal word that has been used since time began. On Ngunnawal country, we have the political heart of Australia, Parliament House, and it's actually been built on a significant site which there were many meetings for millennia. And those meetings brought about many tribes coming onto our country, and they were invited in, and there was much parley happening at those meetings. Very important business and corroborees. There are many other sites around the ACT that are of sacred connection for Ngunnawal people, and there are just some of them on the slide in front of you now. Language for all First Nations people across Australia is an integral element for our cultural identity, for our cultural practices, our law and law, ceremony, and it's about our connection to family and to country. Ngunnawal Dara, Ngunnawal country. As I said, I am proud to live and work on the homelands of my people, Ngunnawal country. I'd like you, the audience, to take a moment to acknowledge where you are and our connection to others. If you feel comfortable, please take a minute just to breathe gently in and out and reflect on what healing country means to you. Just a minute. Thank you. If this was not a pre-recorded session, I would have loved to have engaged with you and heard your reflections and the importance for you of your spiritual connections to your families and neighbours and friends. I'd especially like to hear how you connect with the First Nations people of this great land. For some of you, you may be wondering, why is a fair-haired, fair-skinned woman talking to us about healing country? And if you are wondering that, well, I would suggest that is why we need to continue to have cultural awareness training across Australia. For Aboriginal people, we love our children regardless of the skin colour, eye colour or hair colour, because our children are gifts from the spirit world and they are embraced and brought up and raised in the culture of our people. As many of you may have heard previously, when you take a cup of tea and you add milk, it's still a cup of tea, as our children are still our children of First Nations people. For many, the topic healing country may be about the ecological aspirations of healing country. However, healing country does not include our environmental responsibilities. It's not just our environmental responsibilities, it is much more. It is all embracing. Healing country is about embracing First Nations cultural knowledge and developing an understanding of country as part of Australia's natural heritage. That the culture and values of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples are respected equally to the other cultures and values of all Australians. First Nations people have many responsibilities. Just like the iceberg that sank the Titanic, our cultural obligations extend beyond the surface and goes deep. I am one of many Ngunnawal elders that have the cultural responsibility and privilege as a First Nations elder living and working on my own country. For those of you that do not understand, it's the Ngunnawal people who are the traditional custodians of the Canberran region, and our identity is a collective identity that represents the thousands of Ngunnawal people that belong to this place. Our ancestors were the first voices and first human footprints in the ACT, just like other First Nations people from around the country. This place, Canberra, Noora, is home to my people since time immemorial. And when we speak about country, it is spoken of like a living being. We speak to country, we sing to country, we worry about country, we care and nurture country, and we belong to country. Dara Nilan reflects the deeply emotional and spiritual connection to environment. It includes all aspects of life, including our relationships to all within. All living beings and objects share the spirit of our ancestors, and they in turn have kinship with us. A deeply emotional and spiritual connection, which is the heart of country, that ensured continual systems that were sustainable since time immemorial. Noora and country is of great significance to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. The living environment goes beyond physical elements, and it is fundamental to our identity and relationship to each other. Noora is diverse, complex, and a living entity. It's a place of belonging and nurturing. It has a sacred essence of places that is also present in sacred objects that have their sacredness in nature and connection to place. This essence is still a living connection between Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people today just as it was for our ancestors. It's our connection across all Australia's landscapes, the waters and the seas. And we collectively, right across Australia as First Nations people, always know this. It is known to us as country. And it is alive with an abundance of sacred connection. Country is filled with the very essence of our ancestral beings that created country. It's through country and our sacred places that as individuals and through our families' bloodlines that all of our kinship connections flow from. We have many aunties, many uncles, many mothers, many fathers. We have many cousins, many brothers and sisters. And it is those kinship connections that ground us and connect us to country. It is our connection to each other and to country that gives us our traditional owners' rights, our responsibilities, and of course, duties to country as well. Darranillan embodies the long-held aspirations of the Ngunnawal people and is representative of the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people's aspirations as well. For Ngunnawal, the very first footprints in the ACT were Ngunnawal. The first words spoken in this place were Ngunnawal. And it is through language that we can help revitalise country. Revitalising our language is healing country. In healing country, Darranillan, it must be asked, how is the Catholic community embracing Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander cultures? Why do I have a feeling and an understanding from the other First Nations people that I speak to that there appears to be an us and them within the Catholic community? I have a question. How are the buildings of worship incorporating cultural safety that we too as First Nations people feel a sense of belonging in those places that we walk into? Are they embracing our cultures? And by embracing, are they including our symbols, artworks and artefacts that demonstrate that we are included and wanted too? I ask you to now take a moment to reflect on your place of worship. Is there more than one church that you attend for Mass? And within those churches, how are you personally including the local traditional custodians into that church? Why do we want our symbols and our artefacts within our places of worship? And you may have heard the term cultural safety because it's about cultural safety, about creating an environment that is safe for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. This means there is no assault, challenge or denial of our identity and experience. Cultural safety is about shared respect, shared meaning and shared knowledge. So if as First Nations people, we are entering our churches and yet our cultures are not able to be embraced, shared, respected and acknowledged by the very representatives of the Catholic religion, then how, as a people, do we belong? As a community in a way that unites, connects and aligns practice for our people, we need a consistency across all dioceses and right across Australia. We want equity. We want our rightful places in the very churches that we seek to also pray to God. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people are the custodians of our heritage. It is our right for you and to expect for you to work with us. As the custodians of our heritage, we expect to be protected and celebrated for its intrinsic worth, the cultural benefits and the well-being for all people today and for future generations of Australians. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander heritage must be acknowledged and valued as central to Australia's national heritage within the Catholic Church. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander culture must be consistently seen across all jurisdictions, and that includes the Catholic religion. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander cultures must be recognised for its global significance for Australia. These three aspirations, whilst they may appear high level, they are achievable as they're designed to drive key areas of focus and create benchmarks for increasing First Nations culture to be embraced by all. Australia is home to the oldest continuous culture on Earth. Since millennia, there are uninterrupted cultural heritage sites that have been demonstrated by archaeological evidence. This makes our continent unique in the world. However, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people's view of heritage transcends time into what is widely described as the dreaming. And the dreaming isn't about going to sleep. It is a greater concept. And it is a concept that is expressed in our many Australian languages. Concepts such as Daharamulan or Jukurpa, as Wenton Rubincha, co-artist of the Barunga Statement and a board member of the Aboriginal Sacred Areas Protection Authority, described. The country has sacred sites. That stone, that mountain has got dreaming and himself is sacred country. Not just Free Mountain. We sing that one. We got that song. Well, the song is the history of the country. Albert Namatjira used Whitefella's side of the story. He painted landscape. He painted dreaming there as well. Namatjira used two laws. It is this sacred and spiritual heritage that must, not maybe, but must be included within the Catholic Church. And it cannot just be a tokenistic gesture. Sacred and spiritual heritage must be embraced by the spiritual and Catholic leaders of Australia. The Catholic Church needs to have greater recognition and protection of First Nations heritage and cultures across our great nation. For how can we have healing country without it? In 1998, Pope John Paul II offered Australia's Aboriginal and other Indigenous peoples of Oceania an apology for past shameful injustices of the Roman Catholic Church. In a message posted, he wrote that the Church apologised unreservedly for the part played by its members, especially where children were forcibly separated from their families. The apology to Australia's stolen generation came in a report by the Special Synod in Oceania held in the Vatican in 1998. Why do I mention this? Well, I would like to talk about a subject that is of particular interest to me, both personally and professionally, and extremely relevant for my community and should be for all Australians. Respecting cultural differences such as the influence of family and community obligations on an individual is of the utmost importance for First Nations people. This is where it is essential that non-Indigenous people have a clear understanding of the kinship system that still strongly exists in contemporary First Nations Australia. In my culture, in traditional Aboriginal culture, people must understand that children, our babies, our children are a precious gift from the spirits, and everyone in the community is responsible for nurturing and protecting our children. For they are our link to the past and to the future. Our culture deeply cherishes our children, and violence or neglect against children is not, and I repeat, not, and never has been, a part of our Aboriginal culture, nor the Torres Strait Islander people's culture. This is learned behaviour. Since the very first days of the European occupation of Australia, Indigenous children have been forcibly removed from their families and communities. This is something that has impacted my own family, my mother and auntie, and my siblings. And in that time, since the first days of the European occupation, not one Indigenous family has escaped the effects. Most families have been affected in one or more generations by the removal of one or more children. Nationally, the Bringing Them Home inquiry concluded that between 1 in 3 and 1 in 10 Indigenous children were forcibly removed from their families. Imagine thousands upon thousands of Aboriginal children being removed to institutions and foster homes. And some of those places were run by the Catholic Church. The removal process taking them away from family, communities, and their cultural connections. A deliberate attempt at genocide. Scores of these children were emotionally, physically, and sexually abused in those new environments. Then the impact on the children, families, and the communities has been far-reaching, and the repercussions are still continue to be felt today. And we have a responsibility as Australians working together to ensure that this does not continue, and it must never be repeated again. We understand the key foundations of sacred country is caring for our families and our burais. Our burais are our home. They are the centre of our home, Nura. Daro, Winyu Bandhu, Waru, Najang, Jara, Gwa, Agaram. Earth, country, sun, wind, fire, water, stars, love and the clouds. Dano, Babang, Gagan, Gagun. Mother, father, brother, sister. Daran, Nilan, Nura. Remembering home is healing sacred country. Reconnecting to language, connection to family is remembering home, is healing sacred country. It reflects the deeply emotional and spiritual connection to the environment. It includes all aspects of life, including our relationships to all within. All living beings and objects share the spirit of our ancestors and have kinship with us. A deeply emotional and spiritual connection, which is the heart of country that ensured continual systems that were sustainable, easily sustainable because they existed upon thousands and thousands of years continuously. What I'm saying is that all of us, you, me, we together, need to contribute to reconciliation and go forth on our lands with strong heart and mind in keeping God's creation safe and, when needed, to heal it, so that we have country for now and future generations. This is pivotal in this time and in this place, because we know that across the world they are flying to the UK soon to talk about climate change and the reduction of the damage that we as human beings are committing to our environment. And together, Galambani, you, me, we together, we are walking on sacred ground, and through God have responsibility for caring for creation, our common home, Nura. These children who were taken away became known as stolen generations. And bear with me for a moment. I want you to picture in your mind an onion. And a chef has told me that the strongest part of an onion is actually its core. And the core is very soft, but it's also strong and powerful. And like an onion and the onion's core, our children are integral and central to our living culture. And traditionally, as I said before, children are gifts from the spirit world. They're gifts from God. And at the core of our culture, they are everything to us. And this is why removal of children from their families wreaked havoc and damage to our collective psyche as a nation. I am sure there are many non-Indigenous people that reflect on the very question of reconciliation and Sorry Day. What has this got to do with Australia today? And I am sure that those that do reflect, maybe those that are actually working with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, I would like to point out the fact that there is a need for Indigenous and non-Indigenous people to have a greater understanding and working relationship with each other. In other words, for change to happen, this must be seen by all concerned as a two-way process. Since the initial contact between Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal people over 200 years ago, Indigenous and non-Indigenous people have not had the opportunity to understand, learn, and really share each other's cultural values. And this is where the Catholic Church can play a role. Indeed, as Indigenous and non-Indigenous people, we have not yet really gained a clear and coherent appreciation of the very ethos of each other's cultural worldviews and the impact these different worldviews have on our daily lives. It can be said that this lack of understanding is actually inhibiting the reconciliation process and is a major obstacle in preventing us coming together as a complete nation or as a complete, united Catholic community. Respecting cultural differences such as the influence of family and community obligations on an individual and their families is of the utmost importance for Indigenous people. And this is where it is essential that non-Indigenous people have a clear understanding of our kinship system that strongly exists in contemporary Indigenous Australia. And I repeat, in traditional Aboriginal culture, children are precious gifts from the spirit world and from God. And everyone in the community is responsible for nurturing and protecting them, for they are our link to the past and the future. And our culture essentially deeply cherishes our children. As I said, With the forced removal of children from their families, not one Indigenous family has escaped the effects. And the children became known as stolen generations. The term stolen generation was first coined by Peter Reid in one of his articles in the early 1980s. And by the year 2000, this term stolen generation had become for First Nations people a common and collective tragedy derived from policies meant to deliberately remove the indigeneity. And that is one of the key foundations of genocide. The removal of children to deliberately remove their sense of culture and identity. As a society, we must ask ourselves, how are these historical issues, what do they have to do with us today? Will we understand the physical health, social and emotional well-being of Indigenous people, particularly through the multiple losses and traumas experienced as a result of the separation from country, from family, the forced use of a foreign language and no connection to the language that they had an inherent right to, nor to their cultural identity. First Nations people in Australia have the poorest health and the highest mortality rates of any Indigenous minority in Australia. And we are dying years earlier than non-Indigenous Australians. What impact is COVID having on First Nations people? Are First Nations people accessing the vaccinations that are needed to save lives? Where is the statistics that show the number of First Nations people accessing the vaccinations? Where are the statistics in Australia that are showing how many First Nations people have suffered from COVID or have died from COVID? Why is it hidden? We know that there are also many First Nations people have barely had access to, let alone finished, basic schooling. And less than half the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander population are employed. And it is now recognised that education is a salient ingredient towards improving the health and well-being for all people, thus ensuring a peaceful relationship between all cultures, as it is our responsibility that we pass on a better society to all our future generations. And education isn't isolated just for Indigenous people. All Australians have a responsibility to ensure that they are educated on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander cultures and to know and understand the First Nations people whose traditional custodian lands that they are living on. And remember that all societies are made up of individuals, and it is up to all of us, you and me included, as individuals, to continue to develop our education to embrace, care, share, and include Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander cultures in what we do. And that includes in the church. Why? It's so that we as First Nations people feel culturally safe in the very environments of the Catholic Church, which is committed to protecting our spiritual well-being. It is our collective responsibility as humanity to make the world a safer place for us all. In 1986, Pope John Paul II gave a speech in Alice Springs in which he addressed to broader Indigenous Australia. He recognised our unique culture, our contribution to the Catholic Church, and he also acknowledged a long history of survival despite discrimination. And that is why we must work in partnership to nurture and restore our beautiful, vibrant cultures into environments that represented to protect the oldest continuous culture in the world. Our churches should be Nura, a place and belonging and nurturing for all of us as First Nations people. In this time and in this place, I send a challenge on behalf of my community to the Catholic community across Australia. And that challenge is for the bishops, the priests, and the individuals that make up the congregations to collectively work with us. We want you to collectively work with us, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. We want you to honour Pope John Paul II's words. Work with us across every diocese to identify, protect, conserve, present, and transmit for future generations the unique heritage of First Nations Australia. And this can only benefit you as well. The Catholic Church, represented by the leaders, have the power to bring that cultural change for our people. I address you now in the words of my ancestors, in a language that we have done much to revitalise in the last 3 years, and in revitalising, committed to healing country. Yuma Yumalundi, Yango Nalawiri Dunimanyan, Nanawawari Darawari, Dara Nuna Nurambanya, Murambiji Mangari Jinyala, Golambani, Naraganawali Ria, Yarabinyan, Nuna Yarabi Yango Yumalundi. Today, I have gathered here on Ngunnawal country, and this country is my ancestral and spiritual homeland. And together, we are keeping the pathways of our ancestors alive by all of us walking together as one. Oftentimes, we may say you leave your footprints here. And when we say you may leave your footprints, we do not mean that literally. What we are challenging you to do is to go out and make positive change for our First Nations people in the spirit of reconciliation for all Australians. And it is through that we can heal country together. Dara Ngunnawal Yumalondi, Janyamaba, thank you. As a person proud to live on work on Ngunnawal country, I would like you to now take a moment to acknowledge where you are and where your connection is to others. And if you feel comfortable, please try this short mindfulness acknowledgement of country. I invite you to take a few minutes to put down any thoughts racing around in your mind, any hassles or tensions you bring with you. Get rid of anything that you have in your hands and sit comfortably, somewhere in your garden or maybe in a park. Take your shoes off and feel a connection of your feet on the ground. Rest your hands in your lap or on your knees. If you feel comfortable, you might even like to close your eyes or just soften your gaze to the distance and take a moment to notice your breathing. Focus on the feeling of breath entering and leaving your body. Now take your focus to your feet and feel the connection to country. This ground connects to where people came and met, shared, connected, and learned for many thousands of years. Feel the very ancientness of this land. Feel ancestors and the past elders through your feet on the ground and the very air that you're breathing. For thousands of years, people have walked on this ground where you have your feet placed and where your home is. Feel the footsteps of the people who have walked here before you. Then take a moment to acknowledge that the land you are on today is the traditional land of those people and of the First Nations people who are the traditional custodians of that place. And for me and those others who live here, it is Ngunnawal country. Where is it for you? Breathe in their love of country and acknowledge their strong connection and relationship with this place. We pay respect to elders past, present and emerging, and we thank them for their continuing connection to country, culture and community. Now slowly bring your attention back to your feet and notice the feeling in your breath entering and leaving your body has changed. And with one mindful breath, open your eyes and do this again to remind yourself of healing country. Take care, my people.